I hope you're enjoying my YouTube channel, Surowicz Watercolor. If you haven't already, be sure to sign up to my mailing list where you can receive the latest information about my videos, online courses, workshops, coupons, and giveaways. Now through the end of 2019, I'll be providing early access to the subscribers of my mailing list as well as periodic exclusive tip videos. You can click on the link in the top right corner to sign up to my mailing list, or you can find the link in the description of this video. Now let's begin the tutorial for my painting, Early Snow. The photograph on the right was the inspiration for this painting, and as the name implies, it was inspired by an early snow that we just experienced. It's currently early November, and we just had general snow that came through and put down about 5 inches of snow, and temperatures down to about 8 degrees last night. So it's signaling that winter is on its way. This is actually a photograph that I took from my front yard looking across the street in my neighborhood. If you compare the reference photo and the finished painting, you'll notice that I made several adjustments to the composition. Some have to do with placement of some of the trees, some have to do with the terrain, and also made adjustments to where some of the values are in some of the shadowed areas. And this is where I did some of that problem solving in my sketchbook. I have a few other pages of some of the thumbnails I did, but basically this is where I worked on how I was going to interpret the reference photo that I was using. This is the last page that I had in my sketchbook, and on this particular page I have a few thumbnails that I did with a ink pen, and then I came in with a wash of Payne's Gray and did some small value studies. One of the things I was focusing on was just the overall shapes. So I indicate where some of the trees are, some of the slopes of the land, and then I come in and work with value, and in particular I'm looking at the placement of the darkest values, the middle value, and the light value to help me establish a foreground, middle ground, and background. This is the sketch I did with a B pencil on a quarter sheet 11 inches by 15 inches of 140-pound cold press Watercolor watercolor paper. I'll mention that my paper is dry mounted to a piece of gator board using masking tape, and I'll be working at about a 15 to 20 degree angle. This is going to be a winter scene, and I want to have the feeling of some snow blowing around. So one of the methods that I use frequently in my winter paintings when I want to create that effect is I'll be using some liquid mask. And because I'm working with transparent watercolors, I need to plan that in advance. If I was going to come back afterwards and use opaque white, I wouldn't worry about it so much, but I'm just working strictly transparent. So to get some of these textures and get the feeling of snow laying around, I'll be using a couple different techniques for applying liquid mask. I'm going to begin by applying some liquid masking using this plastic squeeze bottle, and this has a tip on it that you cut the top off to get the width of the bead that you want to come out of the bottle. And I use this bottle that I fill myself, and I use it when I want to have a broader bead than some of the fine line bottles that I use. And here I'm just giving an indication of some of these tree trunks because they're going to have some snow clinging to the sides, have some light reflecting off it, and I want to preserve some of that pure white of the paper for later in my painting process. You'll notice that I'm fairly loose in my application of this. I'm not trying to get with a lot of detail. I'm just basically trying to give the indication of some shapes, some patterns. I try and vary the lengths of these. These are going to be linear marks. They're going to give a suggestion of a wooded area here towards the background. Here I'm using this applicator bottle to mask out some of the areas where snow would be lying on these two pine trees that are in the foreground. Here I'm going to continue applying liquid mask, but I'm going to use this applicator which has a steel tip on it. It has a finer point than the one I was using previously. The fine line variety of applicator tends to clog fairly easily, so when you stop at all, you want to make sure that you cap it so that it doesn't dry out and clog on you. So I'm using this applicator to make some finer lines that represent some of the branches and some of the brush and things that are sticking up from the ground and just hanging around all this wooded area. It just creates this kind of texture and pattern and some of these linear shapes that are very interesting. And I need to preserve those now with masking fluid, because you can't go back and get the nice white of the paper by lifting. You can do a little bit, but you can't get these types of linear marks. Very hard to get those just using a lifting technique. The next technique I'm going to use is just splattering some of the liquid mask using a toothbrush. Before I begin this, I put some soapy water in it so it helps clean the brush afterwards. But I just take it, I dip it in the jar, and then I just pull back the bristles and let it just splatter some of this texture throughout the area, and it creates some texture and some pattern in the woods, and then it gives the feeling of snow flying around in this winter scene. Is a nice way to do that. So you'll see I also just strike it and tap it on my hand sometimes instead of pulling the bristles. And when I tap it, it gives a larger mark, a lot larger shape than when I pull back the bristles and just splatter it that way. Before I begin to paint, I'll go through the colors that I used in the painting. Cerulean blue, royal blue, quinacridone rose madder, pyrrole red, quinacridone burnt orange, which is a color that I just recently added to my palette, and I removed the burnt sienna from my palette and replaced it with the burnt orange. I also used raw sienna, raw umber, and sap green. I'm going to begin by putting a light sky wash in, and this is a mixture of cerulean blue with some quinacridone rose madder and a little bit of raw sienna in it. So it gives me a bit of a violet tone, and then I add the raw sienna to help take it a little bit towards neutral. So I'm using a 1-inch wash brush, and again I'm working at about a 15 to 20 degree angle. And I'm just using big strokes, and I'm going over top of a lot of the different objects that are going to be in my composition. But this is a very light wash, and much of what I'll be adding will be darker than this. So I'm not concerned with trying to paint around trees or anything like that. But I do need to be aware of where the snow line is in the horizon line, and where the contours are of the various rolling hills that I have in my composition. And I'm doing this with reference to my sketches in my sketchbook, and more there than and not so much my photograph. So here I've taken the same mixture, but I've added a little bit more rose madder to it to give it a little bit of a red violet up there in the sky. And now I'm bringing this wash, this same color, down into some of the areas where these rolling hills are, and I'm casting some of these areas into shadow. So these areas that I'm painting start to define where the pure white of the paper is going to be versus some of the areas that might have light, middle, or dark values on it. And I'm painting this as a large wash over my entire composition, even though there's many different elements involved with it. And keep in mind that I have masking fluid down also, so that's going to preserve a lot of the white. Now my paper is saturated from the wash that I've put down, and I'm going to come in and give an indication of where some of the mass that makes up this tree that's more in the foreground, and then also the distant woods are. So one of the things that's important is maintaining soft edges for this. I don't want a bunch of hard edges because the tree is just a bunch of branches, and it almost creates like a smoky appearance to it, but with all the branches coming together, and rather than just a bunch of hard edge things without the leaves on the trees. So I want to do this while my paper is wet, and I'll give these soft edges. And these are some of the edges that you have to think about and plan for, because it's hard to come back later and come up with soft edges that look natural, look like they're part of the painting. You can come in and scrub it with a sponge, but it doesn't have the same appearance. Now I've changed to a mixture. The one that I was just using for the trees is a combination of raw sienna with some burnt umber, a little bit of burnt orange in it, and even a little cerulean blue. But now I've switched to a mixture which is more sap green with a little pyrrole red, some raw umber, and some royal blue. And I'll use those in a variety of ratios depending on the value I'm after. And you'll notice that I've changed, even though I've changed colors, my value is pretty consistent with what I've done in the tree areas with the warmer tones. And right now, that's what I'm thinking about more is value. And color is important, but color without regards to value is going to be ineffective. So these values that I have right now are going to dry lighter because watercolor dries lighter, and I'm going to have more of a light value in the distance in the background, and more of a middle value in the middle ground, and some of my darker values are going to be more in the foreground, in particular on some of the pine trees, the two pine trees that are there that you can't really see yet because I'm just painting the background behind them. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be painting that area a much darker value, so it doesn't impact what I'm doing. It doesn't stop me from painting where those trees are going to be. Part of them are masked and part of them are going to be covered with a darker value, so I can just paint the background like this. But this is all part of the planning stage when you're thinking about your process and your approach and where you're going to start your painting and move it forward through your process. You can see here this has been thoroughly dried, and it's much lighter. And over to the right, which is farther back, it's a bit of a lighter value than what I have to the left, which is more middle ground. And now I'm taking a number 3 rigger brush, and I'm just using some of the mixtures that I have with some of the raw umber and a little bit of royal blue in it, and taking some burnt orange also, and making just kind of a dark middle value to give an indication of these tree trunks. And I'm painting alongside some of the marks that I made with the masking fluid. So these dark marks I'm making, which are kind of on a shadowed side, are going to be more contrasting once I remove that masking fluid, and I'll have that light white shape right beside some of these. They're not totally at the darkest part of the value scale. I don't want them to be that dark in this area. These are very much a dark middle value that I'm applying here on these distant tree trunks. I'm going to save my darkest darks more for the foreground here. I'm going to continue to move across the composition here and continue to put in some of these tree shapes. There's quite a few of them, and you can see that I don't try to render each and every tree trunk. They're just statements that I'm making with a brush mark, just to give a suggestion of a variety of trees that are there. Sometimes what I like to do when I'm putting some of these brush marks down to represent these trees as I am, is I'll come in and I'll take a spray bottle, a fine mist spray, and I'll just spritz some water on it close and let that mist just break some of those lines up and let them diffuse a little bit and create some soft edges. So you have a combination of hard and soft edges by using this technique. Now I'm going to give an indication of this tree that's in the foreground here. I'm going to paint the trunk using some of this mixture that I have in my palette, which is a combination of raw umber with some raw sienna, some royal blue in it, a little burnt orange, and I'm going to just give an indication of these branches. Remember that I've used some masking fluid here to make some linear marks also to give an indication of the branches. And one of the things I like to do sometimes is, once I have some of these marks down, again I'll spritz it a little bit with a fine mist spray, and that will help soften some of the edges and break some of these lines up a little bit. I don't want them just to be long continuous lines that don't have any interruption, because there's lights and darks going over top of one another throughout the whole mass of this tree. And now I'm going to take that fine mist spray and just hit some of these areas. Just softens the edges a little bit. Now I'm going to take my #1 rigger brush, and I'm just going to give an indication of some of the branches coming off of these tall trees here. I'm going to bring some of those over to the left of my composition here. Just making some marks to suggest some branches here, and a few of them are at different angles. I like to blot them. That's another way I like to cause an interruption on a linear mark that I've made, so it's not such a rigid line, but it kind of has a lost and found element to it. I've switched over to a 1/2-inch flat brush, and I'm using a very dark valued mixture that's made up of royal blue, sap green, pyrrole red, and raw umber. And now I'm starting to give an indication of this evergreen tree sitting here. And as I had mentioned, I wasn't concerned about the areas I was painting where these two trees are going to go, because I knew I was going to come back over it with a much darker value. And the pure white, that's the snow that's laying on these trees, is going to be preserved by the masking fluid. So I'm starting to establish my layers here in my position of these shapes in space. So I'm going to have my darkest values here in the foreground, some middle values in the middle ground, and then my lightest values are going to be in the distant background. And that's in line with what I worked out in the sketches and studies in my sketchbook. Here you can start to see these evergreen trees starting to take shape, and they're very dark valued, and I'll have the white of the snow when I remove that masking fluid, which will give me a nice area of contrast. And I'm going to come here with a spray bottle, just touch the areas of green that I've put here, just to soften the edge and let the color run a little bit. So I've put one there a little bit in the distance, and now I'm just putting a touch of spray to not only just soften but let that color run a little bit and help it fit into the overall painting. I want to come back in with a stronger middle value tone here, and I'm putting that in this area of these very tall trees, and I'm using a mixture of sap green with raw umber, a little royal blue in it, and that blue helps make it a little bit of a cooler color as far as its relationship to these evergreens here. So that helps differentiate where these shapes are occurring in space. And you can see I've painted that whole area as a large area of value, because that's really how we see it. Even though you see the trunks of the trees and the branches and everything, you really don't need to try and render each individual tree. It's just not going to have the same impact in your composition as this large shape. Because we see trees, when we look in the distance and we see a tree line and there's 100 trees, we don't read them as individual trees so much as we see it as a big tree line with a lot of, say, linear trunks and branches intertwined. I want to carry some of that green tone to the other side of my composition. So I'm going to make a few brush marks here using that mixture with the sap green in it. And I'm going to use the spray to spray it upwards and diffuse that color upwards and help tie the whole composition together a little bit as far as color. It also helps bring some of that middle value to the other side. Now I'm going to take my 1/2 inch flat brush and I'm taking a wash with the cerulean blue, quinacridone rose madder, and some royal blue in it, and then also some raw sienna. So often I try to get my mixture into the general area of color that I want on the color wheel as far as hue, and then I'll tone it down a little bit, the intensity, by bringing in a color from the other side of the color wheel. So here, when I'm doing snow, I'm often mixing some blues and some cool red mixtures, and then I neutralize it a little bit by bringing in a warmer color from the other side, such as raw sienna. So I take a little raw sienna, mix it in with a violet tone, and it starts to neutralize that color a little bit. And I'm using toned down colors in this particular painting. The other important consideration here is what I'm doing here with value. So I'm using this middle value wash to help define the role of the land, and it also helps me clarify the difference from the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. I'm going to put a wash over that distant area of snow. It's under the trees, and later on I'm going to come back and put a darker value in the foreground so I can maintain the feeling of depth in the composition. I need to do a bit more with the distant tree line and the branches in the area that make up that tree in the foreground. So I've got a 1-inch flat brush here with a wash that has some of the quinacridone burnt orange, a little raw umber, a little raw sienna in it, and I've started working wet on dry, but as I start to paint, the paper gets saturated, and as I continue to add to it, I start to work wet and wet. And you can see here I'm getting a little better definition of that tree line, but I have a bit of a hard edge on the top, so I'm going to soften that edge a little bit with a spray bottle. So just spray upward with that and just soften that as it moves away from the mass of the trees. I want to do much of the same here with this tree that's in the foreground. So I'm going to take my 1-inch brush, just touch some of that color, some of that value there, and then again soften those edges up a little. Let that run around and feel like a watercolor. I'm going to take a dark mixture here using raw umber, some royal blue, and a little bit of burnt orange, and just using a round brush, but I'm just going to give an indication of the tree trunk on this tree that's closest to the viewer, that's foremost in the foreground here. And I'm going to do the same here on this second tree. These two come together and really form a shape, and it's difficult to make them come together as a shape but also maintain their individual characteristics. I'm going to come back using this quill brush, and I'm going to paint in some of these darker values and try and give it a feeling that's more tree-like. And I'll work on this as I progress through the rest of this painting here, and eventually when I remove this masking fluid, there'll be some areas that I'm going to need to paint over to make it feel a little bit more tree-like. Here I'm working on this second tree, and I'm going to wash over more on this tree than on the one in the foreground, because I want to differentiate the two a little bit more. And so I'm going to be toning down some of the areas of the white where the snow's laying on this second tree so that it recedes a bit more behind this tree that's more in the foreground. I want to distribute some of this darker value in some of these areas, other areas here that are more middle ground, even though they're in the middle ground. I want to have some of that value showing. It's not dominant by any means, and some of these I'll soften a little bit, but I'm just taking my rigger, or not my rigger brush, but my quill brush with some of this dark value, and just making some of these tree trunk shapes, some of these branch shapes. Some of this would be areas in between tree shapes. And here it's just a suggestion. I didn't go back to my photograph and try and count trees. I'm just giving an indication that there's some very tall trees there. Now I want to bring some of that over to some of these other smaller tree trunks. There's going to be some darker values in this area, but they're by no means dominant, as I had mentioned. The darkest shapes, the strongest contrast is going to be in the foreground here. I also want to carry some of this value into the branches of this tree to the right that's more in the foreground. So I'll take that dark value and I'll touch it up the side of the trunk and up into some of the branches here. But it's not the whole thing. I make a mark and I lift my brush. I make a mark and I lift my brush, and I let things cross over and go behind other shapes, other linear marks. And then when I remove that masking fluid, there'll be some lighter marks there that I'll even go over some more. When I put down the masking fluid, I use the splatter technique to give a suggestion of the snow and flying through the air and laying on the different branches. And I want to repeat that texture, that pattern, with some darker values too. So I'm just taking a combination of the colors that I've already used, and I'm putting it in my brush and just splattering some of that around the tree and up into the wooded area. And you do want to maybe cover some of the areas where you don't want to get some of that splatter, but you don't have to be over careful with it. It provides an area of interest, I feel, to the composition. And provides a little bit of life that you can't paint with your brush. And then here again, I like to use the spray here just to soften things up a little bit and let them blend in with what's going on. And then I'm going to, now that it's wet, I'm going to put a touch more of that splatter in there, and it's going to soften up because of the saturation of the paper. I think texture is another design element that too often gets overlooked. As I mentioned, I want to have some of the darker values here in the foreground. So I want to come back on top of this area of snow with a darker value mixture. Same colors. I'm using the royal blue with some quinacridone and rose madder and some raw sienna mixed in, and a little burnt orange. But it's a fairly dark middle value that I'm applying here, and I'm leaving some touches of the lighter valued areas that I put down previously. But now I can differentiate this a little better again from foreground, middle ground, background. When I put that distant wash on there, it started to make it feel the same as what was happening here in the foreground. But now I've put this kind of a steel blue gray wash on, and now it feels different than that wash in the distance. Next, I'm going to remove the masking fluid. So my paper has been thoroughly dried with a hairdryer before I do this. And now that I'm pulling this off, you can see the whitest whites of the paper being revealed, and those large areas of white that are on those trees. And I'm going to have to do a little bit more to define those. They kind of, it's easy for them to get lost with everything going on, and just the kind of random application, random with a purpose application of masking fluid. You don't see it all to start. So now I've removed this, and I'm going to come back, and I'm going to start painting around some of these shapes and cutting in some of the edges, and then washing over other areas of it. Here I've got a very dark value. This is the same mixture that I've been using with the royal blue and sap green, raw umber, pyro red. I'm using my quill brush. Here you can see I'm trying to define the vertical shape created by the trunk a little bit more, but I'm also starting to paint around some of the whites that where I put the masking fluid, and try and make it feel a little bit more like an evergreen. And I'm going to work to try and distinguish the two here from one another, although when you look at the photograph, they kind of just come together and make kind of an odd shape, but we know that there's two evergreens there, so you need to give the viewer a little bit more information so that it makes a little bit more sense to them. So now I'm going to go back to that second tree shape and try and make it move back a little in space so it feels more like it's behind the tree in the foreground. So I'm taking a wash here and going over some of those white areas that I saved and toning them down so I can start to differentiate these two tree shapes from one another. Even though they form one big shape, you need to be able to tell that they're separate trees there. I want to put a wash over some of this middle ground here to make it go back a little bit more from this tree in the foreground and reduce the contrast there so it didn't feel so much a part of this tree in the foreground. I'm going to take some of this dark value and just give an indication of some more branches here towards the bottom, kind of reaching out and overlapping some things. I want to bring just some touches of a dark value down here into the ground itself, where some of the rocks might be peeking through. I want to have some of this darker value in some other areas here just to help balance things out a little bit. So just a few touches, just like some rocks coming through here in the shadows. And I want to vary these brush marks that I'm making. I don't want them to all look the same, so try and give them all a unique shape. And I'm going to stretch that value out a little bit more. Have a few touches of it around this tree here that's in the foreground also. Just a few marks, doesn't take much. I'm giving more, again, more of an indication of some of the dark branch shapes that don't have a lot of snow on them. Maybe casting shadow here on the left side to give a little more volume to this tree here in the foreground, so it's not so flat, and it makes it feel more like again, an individual tree, so that these look like two independent shapes, although they kind of come together as one. I'm going to put a white mat on this to get a good look at it, and there's my painting, Early Snow, inspired by the snow that I had last night at my house. I hope you enjoyed this. If you haven't already, you can click on the box in the top left corner and join my mailing list, where you'll receive the latest updates and information about my videos, as well as coupons and giveaways. And as always, if you have questions about my materials, you can go to the studio page of my website. And if you have specific questions, you can email me at contact@surowicz@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.